In the previous part of this course, we've learned about the history of the Linux system. We introduced a lot of information necessary to work with the system. We spoke about Linux's components, and about its operating principles, etc. In the coming part, we'll move on to more practical aspects of Linux. First, we'll install the system. Before we can install, work with, or modify Linux, we need to provide certain information. So actually, answer some basic questions that you probably have in mind by now anyway. Our first concern is that Windows is already installed on our PC. What do we do with it? We know that a computer can only run a single operating system, but that doesn't mean that only one operating system can be installed on our machine. Linux and Windows can marvelously coexist on a single machine. During the installation of Linux, disk space for the second operating system will be reserved. This can be done automatically by the installer that's able to find the free space available on the disk and allocate it to the operating system being installed. If there's sufficient space on the disk, the installer will take care of everything that it needs to be done to fit the new system somewhere on the disk, install it, and be able to run it. After the installation, when you start the computer, a list containing all operating systems installed on your computer appears. In the case of Linux, sometimes there's a list of all the kernel versions that are installed. The user selects from the list the system that he or she wants to run. One of the systems may be the default. Sometimes this would be Windows, sometimes Linux, depending on the user's preferences. This list may be modified after installation. What the installer does or creates is not final and can be modified later. We can modify the list of operating systems later. Another way of keeping both Windows and Linux systems on one machine is using the so-called live CDs or live DVDs. Linux can be run almost automatically from any data carrier. It doesn't have to be our computer's hard drive. Most distributions provide demo versions on so-called live CDs or DVDs. Sometimes those could even be ready-made images to put on USB data carriers, from which we can boot the system. This way of distribution allows the user to run the system directly on his or her computer without installing it. From the live CD or live DVD level, usually there's also a possibility for installing the system via simple application, a shortcut which should be located on the desktop of the system. Ubuntu and Fedora distributions are shipped like that. The default for the download action is the live version. For Fedora, it's the live CD. It's live DVD for Ubuntu. We should remember that if we want to install a distribution from the live disk version, which by its nature has limited disk space, we need an internet connection to be able to download additional software, which will be installed during system installation. Booting a system running from a live disk is perhaps a little slower than booting a normal operating system, but when it starts up, it's almost as efficient as an installed system. Curiously enough, we can install software on a live version, of course, within the limits of the available mass memory. However, such additional software can be lost after reboot. A system can be modified permanently only if it had been installed on our hard disk. The most convenient option for testing Linux, or indeed any other operating system, is using a virtual machine. We can use, for example, VirtualBox or VMware virtual machines. This way we can run Linux as if it were a Windows application. It allows us to create a virtual working environment which emulates the entire computer. Part of the resources of our actual system is reserved for the needs of the virtual operating system. Then, on that reserved part, the system is installed. as if we were installing it on a dedicated hardware. There are many advantages of such solutions. First, we can work on both Windows, where we use, for example, email, instant messaging, our favorite web browser, and Linux, which will be running in a separate window at the same time. It's the only way to run both operating systems at once. Linux is running de facto as a Windows application. This is a major simplification, but we can understand it that way. Virtual machines also have the advantage that they allow us to test various system options without any risk to our main operating system. For example, if we fear that we could delete some disk data during the first installation, such a risk is always present. We can perform the installation safely on a virtual machine first, because that way the system is installed in a file that is created on the hard disk. There's no possibility of an accidental deletion of a hard disk partition, a loss of any data. Recovering the system after a failure caused by our actions, experiments, etc., is also very easy, as virtual machines usually let us create a backup and simply load it like it would do with any other file. In this course, we're going to use the VirtualBox tool, which in my opinion is a little lighter than VMware. It consumes fewer resources and is quite intuitive. All examples are done using this tool.